So,
Awesome.
hello.
Gavin, you want to get us started?
Yep. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to In the Loop, a podcast by Texas Guadalupe. We are the University of Texas Hyperloop team, and I am your co-host, Gavin Nader. I am the head of business, and I am a senior here studying economics.
I'm your other co-host, David Spittler. I'm the head of engineering for Texas Guadalupe and currently pursuing my master's in mechanical engineering at UT. Today, we'll be hanging out with Paul Sean Hill. Paul Hill spent 25 years with NASA developing space station construction techniques and supporting 24 missions as a flight director, including Space Shuttle and ISS missions. Paul then served as the director of mission operations for Human Spaceflight for 7 years, and Paul is now an author and speaker applying his mission control expertise to help create high-performing teams. Paul, how are you doing?
I'm good. Morning, fellas.
Morning.
Giga Maggies.
For sure. So, as a third-generation Aggie, was there ever any debate that you were going to go to A&M, or was it just set in stone from the time you were born?
No, I would say for my daughters, it was set in stone for them from the time they were born, because both of their parents were Aggies, and by then I was a third-generation Aggie. But we talked about it some when I was a little kid, but we didn't talk about it all of that much. In fact, for the longest time, I thought I was going to go to the University of Florida because I was living in Florida when I was in high school. But I ended up graduating from high school in Texas, and that changed things. And then it became a very easy decision to go to Texas A&M, somewhat with the family legacy. Plus, I wanted to be an engineer, and I realized there's one or two other engineering schools in Texas, but with the family legacy, that made it an easy call. And I had an Air Force scholarship, so I was going active duty in the Air Force as soon as I graduated. That plus the Corps cadets at A&M, it all just kind of lined up really neatly, and I'm glad it did now.
For sure. What was kind of the inspiration for wanting to go into the Air Force as well?
Early on, I wanted to be an astronaut, so I wanted to fly jets, wanted to be a test pilot, wanted to be an astronaut for NASA, go to the moon, go do whatever else NASA was going to do. Growing up, I thought that's what everybody wanted to do. I really did think everybody's dad worked for NASA because that's what I knew when I was little. And so I always had in my head that would be a very cool thing to do. In fact, I had a pilot slot and was going to go to flight training when I was an undergrad at A&M, but I got sidetracked a little bit just before my senior year when a professor walked in and he drew this set of curves on a chalkboard. Back in those days, we had chalkboards still, and the first curve was he just writes this low curve, then he writes another one higher, and then another one just barely above that one, and he writes bachelor's degree, master's degree, PhD, and a dollar sign. And he turns around, he says, "Here's the applications for grad school. Any questions?" I thought, that's a good idea. Stayed and got my master's degree, but I was going into the Air Force either way. In fact, I really thought I would go active duty with my master's degree, go back and get another pilot slot and go to pilot training, and still stay on that path. And it didn't work out. Those things are kind of hit and miss when you're in the Air Force. In fact, I had officers tell me before I stayed in grad school that if you want to fly, you have that pilot slot now, you better go do it. As it turned out, I got assigned pretty much by the roll of the dice to a Space Command job, doing kind of an odd spy satellite related space job. And I went from that job to, I left the Air Force and went to work for a contractor at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. That was starting the initial design work on the operations for the space station. So not designing the systems, but now that we have all the piece parts designed, we have them packaged up the way they're going to be flown in the space shuttle. How do you put them together and how do you turn them on? And I did some of the initial work with a number of other engineers on all of that initial planning on how many flights is it going to take, how many spacewalks, what kind of power do we need to have to activate the space station, that kind of stuff. And each of those things just kind of led to the next. I in fact, when I was active duty in the Air Force, I was unhappy for part of the time because the job I had was not very technical. I mean, even though it was a space related job, and I thought that I had a master's degree that I spent too much time earning that I was now not using in the Air Force. And it turns out the work they had me do in the Air Force, in particular the leadership role that I was assigned to as a junior officer probably had more to do with my success in my first 6 or 7 years at NASA than any of my technical work. And 6 years after I got to NASA, I got picked to be a flight director, having not done some of the jobs that are normally considered prerequisites to be a flight director at mission control. And one of the things I was told afterwards was they went back and checked my references in the Air Force. And based on things they said about me as a leader, they decided we'll take a chance on this guy who hasn't done some of the jobs we expect him to do before we make a flight director out of him. It's one of those where you look back in hindsight and you think, wow, you couldn't have planned this any better. But I couldn't have planned it at all. It was just I just kind of happened to find myself in a position where, holy cow, I've done all these right things. They're going to give me this incredible job. How'd that happen?
It's interesting you say that because the last guest we had went through the Air Force, and he said that that was really the best thing that ever happened to his career. It really taught him like discipline and self-leadership. So what do you think it is about the Air Force that teaches you that?
Part of it is in the military, and this is not unique to the Air Force, this is the service in general, officer or enlisted for that matter. They don't have the luxury of waiting for you to get 10 years of experience before they take a chance and let you start making some decisions. You have to step up and be that person almost right away. So, I went to like I think it was a 6-week class they quote taught us some space stuff, which was just awful. I mean, speaking as an engineer, this was for non-engineer, non-technical people. And they actually talked about what they called orbital mechanics. And it was just, I sound like an elitist engineer now, but it was hard to get through. But I went from that to I get to my squadron, spend another, 6 months in getting detailed training on the satellite systems that we used. And then right away, I'm deploying in the field with weapons and lots of other people using these extremely classified, very expensive satellite systems. No training wheels or anything. Just me and another first or second lieutenant. And when we pick up the phone and talk, we are talking directly to NORAD at Cheyenne Mountain. And that person is talking directly to somebody who's going to decide, yes, I think we're under attack. No, I don't think this is a risk. And that's at, less than a year out of college, I am in that role and doing that job. So, service wide, that kind of thing happens all over the place where you find yourself as a 22, 23-year-old with real responsibility, real world responsibility with things that have real consequences. And I'll tell you, after 4 years of that, showing up in the Air Force, and by then I was, 27 years old because, I stayed and got my master's degree before I went active duty. So I was like 27 when I got to NASA. But compared to the other people that were 4 years out of college, I might as well have been 10 years older than them just because of the level of responsibility I'd become accustomed to. And I was already very comfortable, not sitting there with my hands folded, waiting to be asked what my opinion was. Again, because of the leadership role that I found myself promoted into in just my 4 years in the Air Force, I always assumed that was the expectation on the job. I'm one of the people that knows what we do. If I have an opinion about it, it's my job to speak up. All of those things were extraordinarily important to me getting promoted at the relatively fast pace I got promoted to at NASA. And it was all a gift from just being in the Air Force.
Do you think that instant responsibility still happens today, or do you think that was a product of the times?
Oh, it absolutely happens today. They don't have any choice. The military, typically the people that are retiring from the military have been in for 20 years. So what are they, 42, 43 years old at the end of their careers. Now, there are some colonels, there are some generals that are there for 30 to 35 years, but that's a really tiny percentage of service. Most people are retiring at 20 years. So, if the bulk of your workforce is these 18 to 25-year-olds, you can't screw around and not let them have responsibility. As widespread as those people are with all the different things that you have going on, you have to rely on them. You have to figure out, how do I train them well enough to that I can rely on them? And how do I build systems where I have enough experienced people also watching and keeping their fingers on the tabs of things to make sure things are going? So yeah, I have no doubt the military still provides that same step up in personal responsibility, confidence building, all of that stuff.
How would you say that your dad kind of influenced your love for space and then eventual career at NASA?
Some of it, not to take away from my dad, some of it was just the organic nature of the fact that when I was born, he was literally one of the first engineers working at the Cape in Florida. I have pictures of my
That's
dad
insane.
standing on the road that goes right by the VAB when it hadn't even been paved yet. It's it's this red clay looking road.
So you grew up around all the facilities, the early facilities.
Oh yeah, you watch the original movie The Right Stuff, or some of the movies about the Apollo program. For me, a lot of that stuff is like watching home movies. I literally remember going out and climbing up the ladder and sitting in lawn chairs on my grandparents' roof. Because the roofs in that part of Florida tend to be either flat or almost flat. And you'd look around, a whole damn neighborhood sitting on their roofs. And after a few minutes, the ground starts to shake and you see this rocket lifting off across the Indian River from the Cape. So going back to your question, David, after having memories like that when I was growing up, I thought, yeah, I want to do that. And, I tell people this story, and I'm sure most people that hear this think that it's not accurate or it's not true. But my older brother, who was 2 years older than me, he and I both learned how to count from 10 to 0 before we could count from 0 to 10. And we were forever counting down. My parents tell us to go to bed. We would do the countdown from 10 to 0 before we'd go running off to the bedroom to go to bed, which seems a little goofy now. I actually thought that's what everybody did. Doesn't everybody count down to everything? Because that's what NASA does. And who wouldn't want to do what NASA does?
Wow. So going from the Air Force, how did you sort of get involved with NASA?
Well, now some of that was definitely with the help of my dad. My dad by that point had left the Cape and had been transferred to the Johnson Space Center in Houston. And by then he was working in the Space Shuttle program. In fact, when I was an undergrad and the Space Shuttle program was working up to its first flights, my dad then was working with the shuttle program and came up and gave a couple of lectures at A&M, which was a very surreal experience for a freshman in the Corps at Texas A&M, to sit and watch my dad giving lectures about how this crazy looking rocket with an airplane on the side of it is going to fly in space. By the time I was getting out of the Air Force then, I knew some of my dad's peers that worked at NASA, and both NASA people and contractors. So I had access to people that were in the business. I could send them resumes and say, hey, I'm interested in coming to NASA. What could I do? Other than that, I didn't know jack about, different NASA centers and what they did and how to request certain jobs. I was pretty much willing to take any cool sounding job because I need one. I've already put in my paperwork to get out of the Air Force. And one of my dad's friends, who I knew, I did a little bit of work for him when I graduated from grad school, but before I went active duty in the Air Force. I had about 6 months. And rather than sitting around not doing anything for 6 months, this guy gave me kind of a charity job and let me do some project work with his company for a while. That guy sat me down when I told him, hey, I've been given these 2 job offers. One of them is to go work for some company that does business for mission control. And one of them is for people that are designing the computers that are going to go into mission control. But one of them was on the flight operations side. Said, the one on the computer thing sounds pretty cool and technical. I like computers, and I think they're offering me more money than the other guys. Do you think I should go to that one? And he said, boy, what are you talking about? Go to mission control. And my dad said the same thing. He says, mission control, MOD, which is the organization, the mission operations director, says MOD is a hothouse for leaders. If you're coming to NASA, go there. Okay. And I put that much science into it, and I went there. And I knew in my first week there, oh my God, that was the right decision. These people, they're speaking my language. Where have they been all of my life?
So what was it like kind of then going into that role, being in MOD, and just kind of getting thrown into it a little bit?
It's funny. I just saw an interview in the last couple of days about some people with imposter syndrome and how that affects them on the job. And I can look back and I know for a fact I felt that in a huge way, because I've come into this place where The mission control people, in fact, are a lot like people in the military, where the people that are sitting in mission control flying the rocket, most of them are under 30. Now, most of them are also more than 22 or 23, because in those days, it took, 5 to 7 years before you had enough experience and had checked off enough certifications that mission control would allow you in the front room to look at the person that's controlling one system on the spacecraft. And so I show up full of confidence, piss and vinegar, if you will, from the Air Force, doing a largely non-technical job. I mean, it sounded technical, but no calculus-based physics or any of that kind of stuff. And I show up and I'm surrounded by people that have been operating space shuttle systems for a number of years. The design for the space station is already well underway, and I'm with all of these people that know it in intimate detail. And so for me, there was an element of it. The confidence are not coming from the Air Force. It was still intimidating because they speak in a language that's different than what that I'm used to hearing. Oh, hang on, I meant to turn that darn thing off. Anyway, they speak in different jargon. They talk fast in different jargon, and they're all pretty sharp and pretty confident on their own. Kind of a unique feature of the mission control culture back then, and in fact to this day. I mean, different even than the rest of NASA, for some of the same reasons that the military is different. Because you get these 25, 28, 29-year-olds sitting in mission control flying a spacecraft. You better have learned some confidence by then. So it took me a while to become comfortable enough, or maybe a better way to say is be fluent enough in their language and in their culture to not feel like I was the outside bull in the china shop, just kind of going around thinking I had better ideas because this is how we did things in the Air Force. It took me a while to get there, but I also was not shy from the beginning that if I sat through an engineering meeting and there was stuff that I didn't understand, I would figure out who were the one or two people in that meeting that clearly knew what they were talking about on that subject, even if I didn't understand what the hell they were talking about. And I would follow them back to their office, or I would go find them in their office later and say, hey, tutor me. I don't even know what the heck this means. Some of it was just basic nomenclature. What the hell does LVLH mean? What does that mean for an orbital attitude control mode? And next thing I know, I've got guys talking with their hands saying, oh, that means this. Next time I'm in a meeting and I hear that, it's not going over my head anymore. Now I speak in that additional part of the language. And, within a year or so, I found myself, fluent in the language. And then the rest of it became significantly easier after that. But I never lost that willingness to go ask for help or to go tell somebody, I don't know what this is. In fact, the longer I was there, the more apt I would be to stop the meeting and like in front of everybody, say, I have no idea what you're talking about. What the heck is that? What does that mean? What is that component? Which, it goes a long ways to one, making sure that you're learning as much as you can and nothing's going past you. You don't think you know something that you don't really know. But it also makes people willing to talk to you more, willing to trust you. They hear you asking for the help. They hear you taking the help from somebody else. You start building up trust around the group.
So you kind of hinted at it a little bit, but what do you think it was about NASA that developed these such great leaders? Was it similar to the Air Force where they give you a lot of responsibility, or was it something particular about MOD maybe?
Well, I would say, as an MOD person, I'm sure I'm biased, but I've been out for a number of years. So I like to say, well, I think the edges of my bias might have worn off a little bit. But I will tell you, especially as somebody that's still on an advisory panel to NASA, and I see much more of NASA today than I did even when I was a NASA executive, I would say that much of this is still, if not unique to what is now FOD, or the Flight Operations Directorate. It's more pronounced there than it is in most of the rest of NASA. It does exist in other parts of NASA. In fact, in the culture at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California is very, very similar to the flight operations culture at Johnson. But I would say there's two reasons. One of them is for the same reason as the military, that they get these young people right out of college. They teach them how to speak the NASA space language, and then very quickly, those people are in a role of doing analyses, building procedures, training astronauts, or controlling spacecraft systems that have real world consequences. So it's a combination of getting the responsibility, but it's also the real world consequences. The thing that makes that operations organization so much different than so much of the rest of NASA, even other engineering organizations at Johnson, is the fact that there are jobs in the flight operations role that there's no more safety net. There's not another meeting to go to where other engineers are going to scrutinize what you said and they're going to stop you before you've made some bad recommendation that goes to some next review and some next review after that. Buck stops here. We're about to make this call and we're going to take an action now that's going to affect the spacecraft in orbit. And to up the ante even more, our spacecraft have people living on them. And if we make this mistake, we're putting those astronauts at risk, whether they could get injured or they could get killed. That kind of responsibility with that kind of real world consequences has a great focusing effect on people individually, but also the organizational culture. And the culture itself, at all levels of the management team, has to be very judgmental and being able to say, you're doing a good job and here's what we see you doing well. Here's what we need to see you work on and get better. And it becomes easier in an organization like that to have those discussions because we all know that we can't afford to make mistakes. That when you go on the job next week, you're controlling the life support system for the shuttle or the space station or the Orion spacecraft. And if you make this mistake, that one mistake could kill the astronauts and we can't get that one back. And so the whole culture has this different attitude and willingness to have those kinds of conversations, to do things like say, hey, we screwed up and we allowed this mistake to get through in this procedure. How did we screw that up? How do we not make that mistake again? Now let's fix it. And let's tell everybody we caught the error and that we fixed it. Let's not go hide that from everybody. Let's tell everybody we caught it. In fact, especially let's tell the astronauts, because we don't want the astronauts worrying that we're hiding our mistakes because our mistakes land on them. And that kind of thinking, that kind of culture, there are other pockets of NASA that do it. There aren't, I would say, besides JPL, there aren't any other large pockets that is just a part of their culture and everything they do, which is one of the reasons, by the way, I say I knew in the first week when I got there, holy cow, these people speak my language. I'm glad I landed here. Bobby Henderson, who was this friend of my dad's that gave me the advice, he did me such a favor.
So talking about some of these high pressure situations, is there like a story that comes to mind of a time where you were just in a stressful situation at NASA?
Oh,
Sure, there's more than one.
it's funny, one man's stress, it doesn't look like anything to the next guy. I tell management teams at companies this all of the time, because the thing that you can see very clearly as a stressful situation is you're in mission control and some bad thing is happening on the spacecraft, and now you have to take action. And holy cow, if you don't take the right action, it still may unravel and you still may kill astronauts or lose the spacecraft. And that certainly adds a lot of pressure. And I was in a number of situations like that. But I tell engineers, I tell senior managers all the time when you're doing it, it doesn't feel significantly different than sitting in a conference room surrounded by experts, and you now think, I think we're making a mistake, or I have a better idea, and I need to speak up. And that feels like a scary thing to do. I mean, you may see some of this still in school, in an engineering class. And the discussion is going down a certain path and you either don't agree or even worse, you don't understand. Now I have to speak up. Golly, I don't want to do that. What if I look like the only dumb guy in the room, or I ask a stupid question? And in fact, those same pressures are the things that often get in the way of people when they first start training to work in mission control. I don't want to speak up and say the wrong thing. And one of the things we work on earliest when people come into that organization is, how do we get you over those things? How do we get you anything that's going to make you reluctant to speak up? Whether speaking up means, I think we're about to do the wrong thing, or I think this is what we need to do and we need to do it now. And even things like interrupting the boss. Say, hey, you need to stop talking because my problem is more important than anything else we're doing. We need to tell the astronauts to do this now. And we focus very early on, in the first few years somebody gets in that organization, to make them more and more comfortable doing those types of things. So, I mean, an example in the space world was, when we had first started flying space station in the first year of flying space station, there were only a couple of small components, one Russian and one American. And the Russians made a mistake with something as they were commanding the attitude control system and the whole vehicle. Now, there you go. So that's the US part of the spacecraft. We're node 1 on the right side, and the FGB on the left side, or that's the Russian part of the spacecraft. There were no astronauts on board. So we only had control from the Russian control center in Moscow or from Houston. And the Russians had a problem with their attitude control system, and essentially it went offline and the vehicle was tumbling. And we only had intermittent comm because the antennas couldn't stay locked on because the attitude was changing so quickly. And in fact, I was at a party, just starting a party at some friend's house, and I get called because I was the flight director that was on console, and on call. And at the time, we only had 2 flight controllers monitoring the spacecraft in Houston. And I go rushing in, call the rest of the flight control team in, and everybody's showing up in flip-flops and shorts and t-shirts, including me. And we spent the next 4 hours engaged with the Russian flight control team, trying to figure out what was wrong with the attitude control system. How do we get commands on board to regain control and to stop tumbling? And we had about 2 orbits left to do it. And in those next 2 orbits, if we weren't able to get on board successfully with commands and get the attitude control system functioning correctly again, we were going to go into an area of the orbit that for about the next 10 hours or so, we wouldn't have had any communications at all. At the end of that 10 hours, our analysis showed us that the station would have run out of power because the solar arrays were not pointing at the sun because of the problem we were having with the attitude. So we were in one of these, we're about to lose the entire space station when we have almost no space station built yet. Great. And that's going to be my claim to fame as the flight director that allowed that to happen. Not that the only important factor here was how I thought it reflected on me, but that certainly is on my mind is, hey, I don't want to be the guy that screwed up the space station. Thankfully, we didn't have anybody living on it, but at that moment, it felt like we weren't going to have anybody living on it. And what made it even harder was there was very little we could do in the US. We had some control of the communication system and the computer system, but the Russians had full control of the attitude control system. So we spent the next 3 hours or so going back and forth with the Russians on what types of commands they needed to put on board, what kind of testing they need to do of them before they put them on board so that we don't make the same mistake that got us in trouble in the first place. And then, as you would imagine, in the end, and it was, I want to say with 20 minutes to spare, we were able to hold our comm system active long enough, and the Russians were able to get the right commands tested on the ground and then on board that we were able to regain attitude control. Went off range, came back 10 hours later, and everything was healthy. And I would say the worst part of that whole event was by the time we got to that last 20 minutes, I had a couple of the top executives from the Johnson Space Center sitting behind me in the control room, listening to everything that was going on. And they were talking to me as I was talking with the Russian flight director. So I'm coaching the Russian flight director and every now and then arguing and banging heads with the Russian flight director. And I have executives behind me telling me, yeah, you need to get him on it. Oh, no, you need to back off. Don't be too hard on him about that. And at the whole time I'm thinking, oh my gosh, we just got to get this command on board as the clock was ticking down. But we got there. And we had a number of other, I was part of a number of other things that were like that, if not even more stressful. But the thing about working in mission control at NASA is the people that you see, like in this picture here, this is actually a space shuttle mission control shot. The people sitting in the room, whether it's shuttle or space station or Orion, those people are just so damn good at what they do. Each one of them, the life support expert, the computer system expert, the comm expert, every one of them knows that system backwards and forwards. They know the test data. They know what that system should look like when it's behaving the right way. They know what it looks like when it starts to fail. And if you can just maintain the right open dialogue and maintain the right tone in the team so that they are willing to tell you when you're making a mistake, or they're willing to tell you, here's what I think you don't understand that you need to get your mind around. So, and then tell the astronauts to take this action, or allow us on the ground to take this other action. If you can learn to run the team in the way that they are all comfortable doing that, in mission control, these experts will always keep you safe. They'll always pull your fat out of the fire if it's possible. And in fact, that's what I try to tell management teams all the time, is you can lead any management team in any business and apply those same ideas. And if you can make any management team that open, where it's okay for any of us to say we're making a mistake, we need to take a better action, most management teams could perform significantly better, and their businesses would perform significantly better just by opening up that level of trust and transparency.
So speaking of trust, I'm curious about like mission control and the flight director's relationship with the astronauts that you're working with. What is that relationship like?
I would say for the most part, it's really strong. I say for the most part that, the astronauts are also really smart people. Like the people in mission control, they don't lack in confidence. So from time to time, there's headbutting. The headbutting is always in the noise, on style stuff. When it gets right down to the nitty gritty, bad things are happening. Something is on fire, or we've lost attitude control, or some major system has a major problem. Things click really well. Astronauts have been trained well enough. They have seen the people of mission control, both in the conference rooms getting ready to fly and in flight. They've seen what they do enough times that they know they can trust those experts to do the math right and give them good advice and good guidance. So in the real critical situations, it flows like you would think it was a hand-picked team of all-stars. The thing that's funny about that also is, I think a lot of people must think that the people in mission control are like that. Every person on that team was hand-selected by the flight director, and these are all just the A team. And it's more like a pickup basketball team, especially for Space Station, that has been flying for, 20 years. More than 20 years. So, day in and day out, there's no way you could just have these handpicked people. There are people that are getting groomed and trained, and they get assigned to your team. And you may have one team on today's shift, and the next shift, the next day, you might have different people sitting in front of you. But you know how well they're trained, and not just on the technical stuff, but on the culture, on this willingness to speak up, the value that we expect you to make your decision based on the data. Don't just guess. Don't just get scared. In fact, if things get really hairy and you're scared and you can't do the math, tell me that. Don't just guess and give me some answer that you made up because you don't know what else to do. Because at least if you can tell me that, we can find some other expert to fill in that gap so that we're making an informed decision. And the astronauts know that that's the culture in the mission control room. So the relationship tends to be really good. From time to time, though, like I said, we argue about the style points when the clock's not really ticking.
Over your career at NASA, did you see, obviously, a lot of change going on in the organization? What did you see, for better or for worse, over your career as NASA changed?
Well, when I started in 1990, NASA, I would say, was not significantly different than NASA had become probably by about 1970. By growing from the Mercury program to Gemini to Apollo, it grew significantly, like by a factor of like 70. So when I showed up, it was this big behemoth already, and it did business kind of like this great big organization. The one thing that I think changed the most significantly was from 1990 to the time I retired from NASA in 2015. That big organization feel started to have a more negative effect on management decision making. on leadership development. The focus started becoming more and more about surviving to get that next promotion, keeping what I have in budget and in number of people. In fact, by the time I retired, in some parts of NASA, this was certainly true at Johnson, the expectation was that the senior managers would keep their mouths shut and just get on board with whatever, quote, the agenda is, and not offer up criticisms or different opinions or anything like that. As you might imagine, somebody that spent 25 years in mission control, as an executive, that was a transition that was difficult for me to make. In fact, I am proud to say I did not make that transition. I refuse to not say, I think we're doing the wrong thing. I think we need to be doing other things. And by the time I retired, that became a very frowned upon behavior from leaders. And so, going back to some of what we talked about before we started, one of the reasons why NASA became less and less effective at managing its own costs and its program costs ballooning out of control, it's related directly back to those behaviors that change as the organization becomes a large bureaucracy. And you become less focused on doing those right things and more focused on keeping as much budget, keeping as many people on my payroll as I can, which doesn't lend itself to making you a lean and mean machine. It lends itself to you just having lots of people and spending lots of money.
So
Not that that's the only thing NASA does, by the way. I don't mean that.
Do you think there's a point like where an organization gets too big? Can an organization that big still act lean and mean? And then how do you stay focused and keep your priorities straight when you're thrown into a bureaucratic position?
So I think the norm for organizations as they grow is to become too big, to become too bureaucratic, for them to lose their way and lose their own culture. So, in our case, when I say things like the flight operations culture is, if not unique, certainly it's more dominant, this focus on doing the right thing for right reasons, being willing to speak up and say the hard thing. That used to be more prevalent in more parts of NASA and in more parts of NASA management. It is a natural tendency of any organization as it grows to start losing that, right? Because the value now starts to become the bureaucracy in and of itself, and the bureaucracy surviving, because as it survives, my power in it survives. So yeah, I would tell you that is the natural tendency. And the way you keep that from happening is staying aware that that's the natural tendency and continuing as a leader as you get promoted up to enforce the same values. So in fact, this is how I explain it to management teams today. This is what the value looks like in mission control when you're flying the rocket. This is how they never have lost the focus on doing the right thing, protecting the astronauts, protecting the spacecraft, and accomplishing the mission. This is how you apply that as a manager. This is how you don't lose that as a manager. And you have to articulate it in terms like that. And you have to articulate it in terms of what's best for the organization, what's best for our product, what's best for what we exist to do, not what's best for me to keep as much budget as I have. That's what politicians do. That's not what thinking businessmen, thinking engineers do in order to stay lean, mean, entrepreneurial, and do incredible things. So I think you don't have to become bureaucratic and lose your way, but most organizations do. Jim Collins's books, Good to Great, Built to Last, How the Mighty Fall, he does a great job explaining the phenomena and how it's a natural tendency, and why even some fabulous teams, you can make a case much of NASA, follow the wrong path, like he describes in How the Mighty Fall, because they forget some of what made them great and they start doing other things. And the best way to keep that from happening is to study books like How the Mighty Fall, and then be willing to apply those lessons to your own team. Say, are we doing that? Am I doing that as a boss? Am I doing that as a leader? And if so, how do we stop that? And what do I have to do so that the people who work for me are willing to say, dude, you are getting in the way. You aren't listening to us and you're making wrong decisions and you're doing it capriciously. At least have a reason for doing the wrong thing. Because if you were able to say out loud in front of the team, I'm going to make this wrong decision that I think is going to put us out of business, but it's going to get me a bigger bonus in the next 2 years. If you were to say that out loud, you might convince yourself, and the rest of the team might convince you there's a better thing to do than just doing that. And the hard part is getting leaders, getting managers to be willing to do that. Because it kind of goes back to what I said before. That feels scary. Gosh, nobody else is saying that. Or if I say that, am I showing weakness as a manager? I mean, holy shit, I'm the man. Everybody knows I got promoted to this job because I am so good at what we do. Why should I have to listen to these people that work for me? And, for me, I go back and I tell these senior leaders, I say, well, when I was the flight director in mission control, I could have said the same thing. Hey, man, I'm a flight director because I'm considered the best of these people sitting in the room. Why would I listen to any of them? And the reason is because every one of them knows their area of expertise better than I do. And every one of them has so much data that they are evaluating and giving me advice on that I couldn't evaluate all of that data myself, even if I thought I was as smart as all of those people. So it behooves me to figure out, how do I get these really smart people to talk to me? And it doesn't take anything away from my value to the team, either as a technical person or as a leader, to being able to rely on the best inputs, the best brain power of these people who work. And that's the trick as a manager, figuring out, how do I make that the value? If I can do that as a manager, then we can grow this team really huge. And if each of the people that works for me on this big bureaucracy, if they all think that way and they apply that mindset to the next level of management below them and the next level of management below them, then we can avoid becoming this big bureaucratic monster that gets in its own way and spends lots of money and is having difficulty doing things. Not that that applies to anybody in particular.
So you mentioned that you resisted that change. I'm wondering how you did that. Were you studying those books at that time? Like, what sort of tools did you use?
Yeah, so I would tell you, MOD, the Flight Operations Organization at Johnson, was not immune to this. The same things that happened to NASA were happening to our same organization. Because like I said, we ballooned from 22 people in 1960 or 1958 to almost 5,000 people by 1990. So just our organization became a pretty large organization. With, when I was the director of mission operations, our annual budget was about $500 million a year. So we were a pretty big organization, and we had started developing some of those same behaviors. My predecessor in the job as the director of mission operations, he had not grown up as one of us. He hadn't been a mission control guy. He was a senior leader that was brought in from a different part of the NASA center and put in charge, because the NASA center management at the top realized that something's going wrong with the MOD management. We need to stick somebody else in there. And this fellow, a guy named Alan Flint, he started us as a management team reading books like Jim Collins's book, Good to Great, and Marshall Goldsmith's book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, which was a tremendous book. It was being exposed to those ideas after I'd been a NASA person for, 15 years by then. I was already one of the most senior managers in the flight operations organization. But by then, my focus, like everybody else's, was what mattered most was how good a rocket scientist you were. And the rest of that stuff is just touchy-feely bullshit. And what we found out was the touchy-feely bullshit that we didn't like talking about, that in fact, a lot of engineers and senior managers don't like talking about, was the stuff that was causing us to erode as an organization. It was causing us not just to keep the culture from eroding below us, but the management team itself was leading the culture astray, putting the mission control team at risk, which then puts astronauts at risk. We figured all of that out in about 2007, after we'd been in the business for 47 years, because we started looking outside of rocket science and technical stuff. We started looking at ideas like about executive coaching, about management teams and personal interaction. And that changed everything. It changed everything because my boss, his eyes opened on this, although it came to him more naturally than it did the rest of us. But it opened my eyes on it and a couple of other, and I mean literally like 3 or 4 of the most senior leaders in the mission control organization. And when we internalized those ideas, when we internalized those judgments on how lousy we were doing as a management team, that we didn't let go of them. And we, in fact, drugged the rest of the management team through studies of a series of books like that, and then applying the ideas from those books to how we were managing. And in the course of about 3 years, we completely changed our management processes, how we develop leaders. The way we develop flight controllers didn't change. In fact, we changed some things about it, but it was detail stuff. But the focus and how we turned them into steely-eyed missile men and women, that part didn't change. What changed is we figured out how to do that as managers and how to undo this bureaucratic malaise that sets in as you get promoted up and the organization grows. And we completely turned things around. And once we did that, actually, it was me as the director that finished that process. This guy, Alan Flint, that was my predecessor, got us started on it. And then I was like a dog with a bone and took the team through more and more and more of introspection on how we managed as a team. And we changed everything and became extraordinarily open in our leadership forums in how we managed the organization. In fact, it exactly mimicked the openness that we demanded in the mission control room. And because of that, when the Constellation program was canceled and most of NASA then went into panic, we were already well down the road of changing how we did business. So like in our first 2 years after that program was canceled and everybody was getting their budget slashed, we figured out how to cut our costs in half, not because they took half of our money away and said, now figure out how to do business, but we figured out how to spot where we were doing things we didn't need to be doing anymore, where we could cut costs, in some places where we needed to make investments, because if we make this investment, then a year from now, we can dramatically cut costs. And we did all of that over the course of about 2 or 3 years, 2 or 3 years that were chaotic years for NASA. And then we showed up cutting our costs in half. In fact, for the way we flew the space shuttle, had we kept flying space shuttle, we would have more than cut our costs in half. None of which could we have done had we not realized, that touchy-feely stuff's not bullshit after all. That's the stuff that we screw up, because we never make mistakes in the rocket science, but we can make mistakes in that stuff all the time. And when we make mistakes on the touchy-feely stuff, the willingness for people to talk back and forth, the willingness for me to hear I'm doing the wrong thing, if we can't do that, then you could do all the right rocket science you want. But if you're not willing to have that conversation, then the right answers don't get taken forward and you do bad things, which is how we lost Columbia. It's how we lost Challenger, and it's how we lost the Apollo 1 crew on the pad. None of that was rocket science mistakes. It was all people related stuff that the engineers and the bureaucracy lost the ability to see.
So talking about Columbia, what was it like leading the Columbia accident investigation team?
Well, to be clear, I didn't lead the entire investigation. I had a couple of teams that I was responsible for as part of the bigger thing. One of them was, and you may remember from the news back then, there were videos where you saw the shuttle flying in the sky. All it was this little white dot. And then there were white dots coming off of it, which was parts of the space shuttle breaking off before the space shuttle completely came apart over Dallas, or not over Dallas, but over Texas. I just happened to be with a group of people and get assigned to figure out, is there anything in this that had the first reports that, I've got a video or I've got a picture of the spacecraft. And from there, over the next couple of weeks, I led the team that developed the process, that we acquired all of those photographs, all of that video, and we learned how to do trajectory analysis on all of those little white dots to try to figure out, where did that thing go? Where did it land on the ground? What's the footprint? The probability of where it would be if it was laying on the ground, if we could send people out there. And I led, as part of that, an effort to scour civilian and military radars across the United States, looking for signatures of that stuff falling. Because, for the first several weeks of the accident investigation, we still didn't really understand what caused the shuttle to fail. We were pretty confident it had something to do with the foam strike during launch, but we really thought it was damage underneath the wing, in particular to the left main landing gear door seal, which is where we thought the damage was, based on some signatures we saw in telemetry before Columbia came apart, which is why we were doing crazy things like coming up with these several square 100-mile footprints to send people out to go search for the early things that came off out west, which would have been worse than finding a needle in a haystack. I mean, we're probably talking about some things that were probably the size of your fist that would look like a burned rock laying somewhere in the Badlands around the Grand Canyon. Good luck finding that. In fact, the furthest west anything that we found like that was close to the Texas-New Mexico border. We didn't find anything further west for that very reason. But we also got lucky because, well, kind of lucky, depending on how you look at it. One of the components that was found in East Texas that was intact was one of the recorders from on board that recorded data both before shuttle came apart and even well, I guess that's not true, not afterwards, because the power went out. But it recorded a lot more data than we had on the ground, and it allowed us to do better forensics to understand that the breach to the wing did not come from the left main landing gear door seal. In fact, it came from the front part of the wing. And after that, the work that my team had been doing became less important. To answer your actual question, what it was like, it was terrible. I mean, every day it was like going into the funeral. It was like going into one more report on family that died, and we can't leave that one behind. Every day we show up for work, we are reminded, hey, we're here today because we failed our family and they died when we were supposed to protect them. Now then, what's on the agenda for us to do today for today's work? And everything that we were doing for the first at least 3 to 6 months was really focused on, holy cow, how do we figure out how we let these people down? Part of it was because if we have to figure that out and fix it before we can fly again. But a huge compelling part of it was we have to figure this out just because we have to figure out how we let them down. If nothing else, is paying penance to not being good enough for those people, that we put them in harm's way and didn't protect them. And I would tell you, for me, every morning was like that when I woke up. Most nights I did not sleep well, whether it was because I was still struggling with some part of this trajectory analysis process that we were working on, and how do we knit all of this together and get something good out of it, or just being haunted by the fact that we failed these people and they died in a horrific way. And it was because of us, because we weren't good enough, not because we made rocket science errors. And we weren't good enough in ways that didn't have anything to do with rocket science. So that was terrible. At the same time, like some of the trajectory analysis work and the image analysis work that we did to enable the trajectory analysis work, that was all stuff that was cutting edge, that when we started doing it, the best experts in the field said it wasn't possible to do. And in the course of about 2 weeks, we went from that's not possible to do to I had several experts on my team. In fact, experts that each one of them in their area of expertise said what you're asking me to do isn't possible to do. And within 2 weeks, they and several other experts from their part of the organization, in fact, figured out how to solve what they themselves thought was an impossible piece of this entire puzzle. My whole job in it was keep them focused on why they think it's impossible, and then stop trying to solve it the impossible way. Figure out, well, if we could do this differently, what would different look like? And let's solve it that way, because you can't do it the impossible way, I mean, by definition. So my job is to keep asking them questions like that in areas, especially in some of the higher level image analysis and the trajectory stuff. These guys were heads and shoulders smarter than I was in their areas of expertise, but they were also stuck behind things they'd already accepted weren't possible. So it became easier for me to ask them questions about things that they hadn't been asking. And then as they came back and solved independent parts of the puzzle, my job is to sit back from a higher level and say, oh shit, I see how these all connect. Here's how we can turn this into a process. So on the one hand, it was a terrible daily experience for months. On the other hand, watching these experts, and again, we're talking people that were almost exclusively below the age of 30, but no kidding, experts, like world level experts in their area of expertise, and to watch them come back and solve things that they thought were impossible, that by the time we flew the next flight, which wasn't until August of 2005, so 2.5 years later, by the time we did it, we had developed a process. I say we, my team had developed a process that allowed us to do that whole trajectory analysis role in real time. So a spacecraft, as we were launching, we had a real-time footprint that if we were to lose that spacecraft in that altitude with that energy state and it came apart there, this is what its footprint would look like on the ground. And we could do that dynamically. And it took us that whole 2.5 years to figure out how to do that on the fly, not do it after the fact. And that became the normal way of doing business. So things like that were huge in I guess gratifying as a team member, as a leader, to see us grappling with those difficult things and solving those kinds of problems, while also carrying this emotional burden that we still carried with us. Now, I led another team, and it was for the return to flight. So different than the accident investigation. It was all about, now, if we damage, well, first, how do we determine whether or not we've damaged the outside of a spacecraft while we're launching? And then if we do damage it, how do we get an astronaut to all parts of the spacecraft and repair it? And all parts of that problem had been declared impossible in the late 70s before we flew the first shuttle flight. And when I was asked to lead that team in late February, I was told by the people running the shuttle program, we expect that you're going to spend a few months studying this and you're going to tell us it's not possible, and we're going to have to move on and just accept that risk and keep flying without knowing how to solve that problem. But by August, so 6 months after the accident, sort of like in that accident investigation team I led, same thing happened. I had a much larger team in this effort, spanning almost all of the technical disciplines across not just the Johnson Space Center, but several NASA centers. And in that 6 months, we solved almost every part of that supposedly impossible problem. And it was the same experience for me as a leader. The technical challenge was huge. The stress on a daily basis, it definitely took its toll on me and other people on the team. But seeing what we were capable of solving, and then spending the next 2 years after that, testing the new equipment, getting it built and installed in shuttle, training astronauts how to do the new procedures that we figured out that went with the new equipment to solve what was supposed to be impossible problems. I mean, again, it was hugely gratifying. We tested all of that stuff, by the way, when we flew the next flight on STS-114 in August of 2005. We tested all that stuff in orbit. When we flew, there was so much animosity in the community. There were large parts of the internal NASA community that didn't believe that any of the facets of things that my team had pulled together, that they were going to work. That I has essentially sold a bill of goods to the space shuttle program and to the upper NASA management, and none of the stuff's were going to work, and we're going to get the next crew of astronauts killed. So, one last gratifying piece for me was the vindication that, oh no, that shit all did work. In fact, the reason we were able to keep flying shuttle flights after that was because all of that work that opened the door for us to finish building Space Station and do other cool things in space. In the end, it's funny that, funny is probably not the right word, interesting, that emotional burden from Columbia never really fully left. And I know for me personally, all the way up through flying that next flight and even afterwards, I still felt like it was sitting back there behind me somewhere, these 7 people that we failed, that lost their lives. And it is interesting that, even on those moments where I felt like we were right to celebrate these impossible problems we solved, I always had this other part of my brain that thought, can't celebrate too much, fellas. Remember how we got here. It's great that we did this. Don't forget what it cost us to get here. And I do think that, it was after that I left being a flight director after that flight. So I'd been a flight director then about 9 years. And it was after that I went into the senior NASA management and became a NASA executive. And then it was 2 years later, I was director of mission operations. I have no doubt at all that the emotional part, the traumatic part of the accident investigation, that return to flight, made me a better leader. In fact, I think one of the reasons why I was open to some of the ideas that Alan Flint was trying to get us to take serious, not just the rocket science. I'm confident that I was more open to those ideas because of my bad experience from that emotions, the trauma of the accident investigation, the return to flight. That made me more willing to listen to what are the other things that are getting in our way? How do we make that easier to do for the next team of leaders? So, this is why we need to be in the same room. Now I need somebody to give me a hug.
Yeah, right.
You guys must be not being in the room for that.
Virtual hug. So sort of on the same note, how do you think an organization can stay uncomfortable with risk?
You have to talk about it like that. One, you have to recognize that as you manage risk, that doesn't just mean risk that a rocket could blow up and kill your astronaut friends. It could be that we screwed up the design on this widget that we've been working on, and 6 months from now, it's not going to work, and our company is screwed because we did that. Or we're going to lose customers because this thing that we sold them doesn't work well enough. It doesn't work as well as we told them it was going to work. Not only are we going to lose their business on this, we're going to lose their business from now on because they're going to go to somebody else whose thing worked the way they told them it was going to work. And the way you keep from losing that awareness is you have to keep talking that way. As you get promoted up as a manager, you have to be willing to put on the table, hey, people, what is it we might be missing? Hey, who in the room is not comfortable with what we're doing and thinks that we glossed over something, or thinks that you have a better answer, or even can tell us where we made a mistake? Let's have that discussion. And you have to proactively make that an accepted behavior. And again, I go back to, I do this because for me, this is such a simple way of understanding the point. In fact, this is why I wrote the leadership book that I wrote that does this chapter by chapter. But the reason we do that in mission control, that we make it so easy for people to say those things, is because of those terrible real world consequences if we make a mistake. All you have to do is figure out, now, how do I keep reminding us of what those mistakes could cost us, and keep that in front of us? Because if you can internalize that value, that concern to not make those types of mistakes, to not let that reality happen, if you can make that the predominant value in your leadership team, rather than you people be obsequious to me or subservient to me as the boss, I make all the decisions, so you guys just sit and execute what I tell you to do. If the value instead is, your job is to make us as good as we can, as good as we can be. Your job is to make sure I'm listening to you, make sure I don't let mistakes get through, including my own mistakes. If we can make that the value, we can do incredible things. And all it takes is, as you get promoted up from working level engineer to manager, remember that and make that okay for your team. But you have to keep saying it. You have to keep saying, I know people aren't willing to say these things. Here's why I want you to do it. And you have to reward it. You have to be willing to promote people who do that, not move them aside because that darn guy won't get on board with the agenda, which is terrible thinking.
I know at SpaceX, we kind of have a way of quantifying risk. And with anything space related, there's always going to be some amount of risk, and it's kind of choosing where the threshold is. How was it like at NASA and choosing where that risk threshold was?
I will tell you, it had a couple of different flavors throughout my career. Until Columbia, a lot of it, well, I'll say it like this. So we had 3 different transitions. And if you guys read my book, this is not a test, by the way, but if you read my book, you've probably already read this. But leading up to Apollo 1, leading up to Challenger, and leading up to Columbia, we went through the same transition each time. And we learned the same lesson each time, backed out of it, and then started doing the same bad behaviors. And that is, when I came up from 1990 through the time I was a flight director through 2005, it was not unusual for us to make decisions based on our experience base. Hey, we've seen this before. We don't need you damn engineers to do the analysis and tell us the probability. That's bullshit. I've been in this business for 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. Or, I'm the flight director. I'm the program manager. I've seen it. I've been there and I've done it. I know that's not that big of a deal. Let's move on. Let's table that issue and move on to the next thing. Move on to the next thing I recognize as a problem, and let's talk about that. And we did more and more of that the closer we got to Columbia. And it started in the mid 90s in a large way because we started having our budget reduced. And the senior NASA management at headquarters insisted on, one, slashing the budget to the human spaceflight programs, and then two, holding our feet to the fire to staying on the same schedule and doing the same amount of technical work, but with less and less money. And there wasn't anything done in between on, now, how do you do that? It was just, we dare you to figure out how to do it with less and less money. And one of the ways that we did it was we became less rigorous in our engineering. And we started doing more and more things, shooting from the hip. I would tell you, my biggest fear for a company like SpaceX is that they will follow in the same path. Because you think about where SpaceX is today, it is not unlike NASA in NASA's first 10 years, doing incredible things. You can't take away from them the great successes that they've had. It's incredible. But I will tell you, from SpaceX people I've talked to, they're also starting to sound like they drank their own bathwater, like NASA did, and like most successful teams do. And the more success you have in very difficult jobs, the easier it is to buy into the idea that, guys, we're just good. SpaceX today would be justified to tell people, hey, yeah, I'm from SpaceX. Oh my God, yeah, you guys are so good. Yeah, I know I am. I know we are because we're SpaceX, which that was my NASA experience. The whole time I came up as a NASA person. I mean, still, I could give somebody my NASA business card with the NASA meatball on it and they go, oh my God. Now today it would be, oh, well, yeah, but that ain't SpaceX. But the problem, though, is as you start thinking that way, it becomes easier to not do the same level of rigorous analysis and to look at some problem and go, oh, no, we've seen it before, guys. We don't have to look at that. We know that one's not a big deal. But you might not know it. It might just be one that looks like a problem you've dealt with many times before, but this one's different. And unless you do a little bit more engineering analysis on it, you don't know that it's different. And you don't know that the way you fixed it 10 times before won't fix it this time. Or that it's actually completely different. It just looks the same. And which is, by the way, is exactly how we got to Apollo 1. It's exactly how we got to Challenger. It's exactly how we got to Columbia. Going back to your question, then what does that decision look like? Early on, we did more engineering analysis. We started doing less and less as we gained more experience, as our budget started getting cut and it was harder to do it. And we started accepting more and more things based on, quote, engineering judgment, which is a nice engineering way saying wild ass guessing. Maybe it wasn't quite so wild assed. Some of it is people using their experience, but experience doesn't play well against really complex systems in real complex environments. And the best you can rely on in some cases with experience is what questions to ask and what things to start looking for. It doesn't necessarily mean you can recognize every problem and every solution at first glance. And we lost that. After Columbia, we went back and we started doing a more rigorous job on the engineering. And I would say we swung too hard the other way. And we started using statistical analyses, probabilistic risk assessments, and some parts of the community started using those probabilistic risk assessments as if they were like no shit, hardcore. You can hang your hat that this is the number and this means safe and this means not safe. Well, as you may have already seen, your probabilistic risk assessment is only as good as the model. It's only as good as the data that goes into it. And certainly by the time you start compiling the probabilistic risk assessments from individual components up to major components and then extremely complex systems, the no kidding empirical goodness of that total risk analysis number isn't necessarily so good anymore. You can't really hang your hat on it. In an individual system, you could do an analysis and say, okay, this one has a PRA value of 0.9 versus this 0.7, so clearly this one's better. But a probability of failure for an entire system versus the entire spacecraft, I think that goodness starts to fall down. And we lost our way on that to a certain extent for the first several years after the Columbia accident. I think NASA got to a better place where they found that happy medium for how do we apply probabilistic types of analyses to give us some idea of goodness, in particular for areas that we don't have very much experience. But they also did a good job for just because we have experience doesn't mean we're also not going to do more rigorous modeling or more rigorous tests on some system phenomena, especially if the phenomena is different than we've seen before, or the environment is fundamentally different than we've seen before, like, hotter deorbits, different altitudes, different attitudes, whatever. But we haven't seen it like this in this phase of flight. Let's go do some additional tests. Let's go do some additional analysis. And let's focus on the model itself, how much of that model is actually anchored in real world testing or real world flight data, and how much of that is based on assumptions. We did a really good job of that after a few years after the Columbia accident. And I couldn't tell you with much confidence where they are today, just because I've been out of that level of detail for years now. But I would say, so since you brought up SpaceX, my words of caution to SpaceX would be careful. Be careful that you're buying into how good you are, because that's how teams start making avoidable mistakes. And all 3 times NASA lost astronauts, each one of those failures was avoidable, and not just avoidable in hindsight. Of the 3, the one that's most defensible is Apollo 1 and the 100% oxygen environment, which is really, really clear to us now in hindsight. I would tell you that until that time, the Russians also flew in a high oxygen atmosphere because it makes sense for various other reasons, until you take into consideration flammability, which they changed. Actually, they changed before we did, because they had a fire in test on the ground that they didn't tell us about. So they woke up to the risk before NASA did. But Columbia and Challenger both are inexcusable. They were avoidable accidents that we made because we started buying into how good we were, and we stopped asking hard questions. And I would tell SpaceX at every opportunity, be afraid. The more you beat your own drum about how good you are, and you might be that good, but it should be a warning sign to the leadership team that they're buying in and they're becoming complacent and asking right questions.
So how do you see kind of new tech, or not necessarily new techniques, but the idea of like rapid iteration and testing that you might see on Starship or some of the SpaceX things that we're doing today, versus more of the, let's technically look at the documentation, let's step by step until we're doing a full scale test on something like Space Shuttle? How do you see the differences between those, and just general thoughts on it?
I think overall, SpaceX's development style in rapid prototyping, rapid serial testing is the better way to go. Now, there are certain things. So if you are challenged to build an interplanetary satellite, and 5 years from now you have to launch that interplanetary satellite that's going to land on Mars or deorbit into Venus, there's an element of that you may not be able to do the same serial prototyping to get you from where you are now to there. And you may have to rely more on rigorous and expensive design and development, and focus your development processes on getting it right the first time, and having a test regime that'll catch the small problems that need to be tweaked, or it will confirm that everything satisfies your requirements, and now you fly it and it goes off and is successful. So there are some times when you're going to be in that position where that's the only way you can go. Ideally, you should be driving yourself into programs and developments that enable you to do rapid prototyping and serial testing, because there's no substitute for real hardware and real test and real data. Because you can do all of the analyses, make all the design assumptions you want with the greatest experts in the world, but every one of those assumptions is an opportunity for something that you missed, something that, oh yeah, that works great in 1G, or that works great in one atmosphere, but in a vacuum or in 0G, that doesn't work that way. And we still don't fully understand the physics. And until you have that real data, you just don't know. Or 10 tests on the ground beat the hell out of any analysis full of assumptions on any day. But even with that, you have to go back and take your 10 tests and now deconstruct the data and say, now what is that telling us? Leading up to Apollo 1, Challenger, and Columbia, NASA had a whole series of very successful launches and missions, and then they failed. And they failed at something they had done before many times and not killed anybody. So, yeah, you still have to do both. But committing billions and billions of dollars on something that you're going to do one time and you've got to develop and it's got to be perfect from the start, that is a way to ensure that it costs a whole hell of a lot of money.
So we talked about this a little bit before the podcast, but how do you see NASA's role changing in this new commercial space sector? And yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's an interesting question. So a question that in fact this panel that I'm on has asked NASA, and I can tell you this because this was in our annual report, so this is a public thing. This is not me talking about NASA stuff from behind closed doors. But one of the things that we are asking NASA now is, what does NASA see its role? What does NASA's stakeholders see as its role going forward? Is the intent that NASA plans to predominantly buy human systems for launch, human systems for missions in space, whether it's in orbit or to the moon or to Mars or anywhere else? Is the goal now to set the mission parameters and have somebody else do the development and the flight operations on their own? And NASA's now just the keeper of smart ideas to go do? Or does NASA intend to still play a role in some leading edge development and leading edge flight operations? This panel I'm on, posed questions like that to NASA in our most recent annual report that just came out last month, as a matter of fact. And we'll be having discussions with NASA on that throughout the year. I would say for my time at NASA, NASA's intent was to be moving the marker out. So NASA was not happy with the fact that NASA was still in low Earth orbit 30 years later, and we've been flying shuttle over and over and over, and we're still flying to 300-ish miles above the surface, and we're not going anywhere. We wanted to push the frontier out. We wanted to go back to the moon and build infrastructure on the moon. We wanted to get to Mars and put infrastructure on the Mars. Hell, we want to develop what we saw in Star Trek, what you see in Star Wars. We want to get out of this solar system, and we never get there if we're still stuck in low Earth orbit. So I would tell you, NASA for the longest time has seen itself as the organization that says, okay, here's what we think the objective should be, and we're gonna propose programs that will get us to that next objective. And when we do that, each of those next programs comes with a price tag. Is Congress and the White House, are they willing to pay that price? And as White House administrations change, one president decides, yes, I want you to do that. Next president decides, no, I don't want you to do that. I want you to do something else. And each time you do that, NASA, as the organization that's responsible for executing those things, changes paths, because NASA works for the White House. NASA doesn't just do whatever NASA wants to do. And so, again, NASA has been stuck in low Earth orbit for decades, wanting to get out. I personally think the right role for the agency still is those things that are at the leading edge of the frontier, that are right there on the edge, like lunar surface infrastructure, initial surface infrastructure, not permanent, but initial lunar infrastructure, initial flights to the moon, initial forays and infrastructure on Mars, I think is the right providence for the government-led agency, because it's the area where there's the highest risk that private business typically isn't going to take on, because they have not yet figured out how to make money doing it. The launch business, by the time NASA finally was willing to allow, say, a SpaceX or a Boeing to fly astronauts into space on a rocket that we didn't develop, that we didn't manage, that was definitely overdue by the time NASA was willing to do it. That access to space part, and I would agree that to some extent, NASA and the huge cost that it took to become a provider to NASA was prohibitive, and other companies starting to do that for us. That being said, I think until private companies show the ability to make a profit and to stay in business doing operations on the moon, I think NASA should be proposing and executing programs to do those types of things. As the SpaceXs and the Boeings and the Blue Origins and the Lockheed Martins and all of those companies, as other companies around the world start to build up capability and are able to manage the risks associated with doing those things in real time and make a profit doing it, then I think NASA should get out of the way and keep moving to that next frontier marker that's further down the road. And I'm definitely one that thinks, and that's the order they should do it in. They shouldn't just pay a private company to develop the spacecraft and rocket, put the astronauts on it, and let's go back to the moon for the first time since 1972, or let's go put people on Mars for the first time with NASA standing by and looking over the shoulder. Because if you do that, you're not in fact using all of this great expertise that's still resident inside NASA. And I think you're missing out on the investment that the nation has made in growing that kind of expertise inside NASA. I don't think it needs to reside only there. But I don't know that, let's say, for example, in the next 10 years, if SpaceX was the only company that was flying people into space and flying them to the moon, I don't know that you could make the case that that's private enterprise and that the market pressures are keeping costs down, especially if most of what they're doing is on NASA or federally government funded business. That's NASA still doing NASA stuff, but they're doing it differently, and they're not actually doing it with their own expertise, and they're eroding things that they know internally. So I think you have to figure out how do we enable private enterprise to do the things that they now are able to manage the real risks and can make a profit doing, separate from us. How do you enable that with NASA then still focusing on those things that are at the frontier that private business still can't make a profit doing? I realize it's a long story, sorry.
No, we love to hear about this. Kind of on the same track.
It's not a popular view probably inside NASA, or at least in some parts of NASA management.
Mm-hmm. On the same track, I was kind of wondering, with the cancellation of the shuttle program, there was initially a lot of talk of a shuttle replacement, such as the Venture Star or the DCX. What are your thoughts on those programs and the ultimate cancellation of them?
Well, the original plan was we were standing down the shuttle program, and we were going to shift the shuttle program budget to Constellation. And with Constellation, we were going to develop 2 new rockets and a lander and a spacecraft, the Orion spacecraft, and we were going to use that to then go back to the moon. So there was a plan to have things to replace shuttle, sort of, although not without the same capability to bring large cargo back to the Earth's surface from space like the shuttle had. Shuttle could bring 30,000 pounds back from space. There still isn't a spacecraft, even on the drawing boards, that can do that. And things like Delta Clipper. Delta Clipper was a cool idea, and it showed nifty single stage takeoff to 1,000 feet, and it translated over and landed on another pad. So as far as demonstrating control and autonomous guidance that SpaceX actually uses every time they return a Falcon booster to the launch facility, Delta Clipper was awesome for that. Delta Clipper was never going to put something into orbit. You still needed to slap a booster underneath it. You still would have needed additional propellant in order to bring that thing down to the ground using propellant. But it was a very cool demonstrator. I still am disappointed, as somebody who was in NASA at the time when Constellation was canceled, that we couldn't figure out our way out of managing the way we were managing, such that Constellation was budgeted from the start exceeding NASA's budget. And you can make a case that NASA tried to kind of dare Congress to not give us the money for Constellation, not pony up the additional budget that NASA insisted we needed for Constellation. And NASA or Congress took the bluff and reminded NASA and the White House that they control the purse strings, not not the executive branch, and they did not give NASA the budget, and Constellation was canceled. I would say, my personal biggest criticism looking back is that NASA was then, and I would argue to a great extent still 11 years later, not willing or able to grapple with how it managed those big programs, and how it is still not effectively controlling its own costs and focusing on doing only those things they need to be doing, and getting rid of the things that they're only doing them because they always have. And so I think the biggest reason NASA lost that wasn't really the political side. It was because of NASA internally didn't meet the politicians at least halfway in being better managers of their own corporation, as it will. That being said, I do think we made NASA, the nation, made a huge tactical, if not strategic, error by stopping flying the shuttle before we had something to replace it, both for low Earth access and for return from orbit.
Yeah, it was only this summer that we got to see Demo 2 actually finally take people back from American soil up to space again.
Right, and so that was a huge mistake. But I would tell you, I also know that the NASA executives, by the time that happened, found themselves faced with no other option, because they weren't going to be given a budget increase to keep flying shuttle until, say, the Constellation vehicles were flying. They had to make the choice. We're going to have to stop doing this while we finish developing these rockets and these spacecraft. And then it was after that, the either inability or unwillingness to manage differently and to control costs that led to the cancellation of Constellation, which some of my former NASA colleagues would probably be very unhappy for me to say that out loud, but I strongly believe it. I believed it then, believe it today. It's a hard thing to do.
Does the Artemis program seem like a righting of the ship to you then, and getting back on the right path, and all these contracts that they're giving out as well through that?
I am definitely a fan of the Artemis program goals. It is effectively what the goals were in the Constellation program. Go back to the moon because we know how to go back to the moon, build out more and more infrastructure to make going to the surface of the moon and operating on the moon an easier and more normal thing to do, all of which we have to know how to do if we're going to put people on the surface of Mars as more than just a stunt. So all of that plays directly into going to Mars. It's not enough. I mean, getting through the Mars atmosphere is still more difficult than landing on the moon, but all of it plays together. And so I think setting those as goals that are accepted at the national level, that Congress has gotten its arms around, that I think the Biden administration also agrees, those are the right goals, those are the things we should be doing. That is fantastic. That's the first time we've had that kind of agreement on the political side. Since Constellation was canceled. So for 11 years, NASA has been kind of, in my personal opinion, rudderless and trying to do good things and accomplish good things while they can with a federal government that can't figure out what they want their own space agency to actually be doing. So that part, I think, is terrific. I have my criticisms of the approach that they're using on the contracts, the acquisition of key components. I think in some ways, I think they are over applying what they consider lessons learned from the commercial cargo and commercial crew programs to take cargo and then take astronauts to the International Space Station. And I think in some cases they are reaching too far to use the same type of acquisition to buy some of the early Artemis hardware.
Do you think that's within SLS specifically, or as the program as a whole?
Well, I was referring to other components, not necessarily SLS. So you have two challenges, right? So speaking of SLS, you've got traditional, if that's the right word, maybe legacy is a better word, but the pre-existing long heritage aerospace companies that are very large, have large fixed costs, large overhead costs, and deliver large, expensive, and largely very successful spacecraft, over the decades. So you have them, and they and NASA look a lot alike, have great justification for really large costs and really large workforce, versus the SpaceX's and perhaps the Blue Origins, we'll see. But take SpaceX as an example. Leaner organization, smaller fixed costs, lower costs as they are selling services and hardware to NASA or to anybody else. And the trick isn't how do we now just do everything with that model and give everything to companies like SpaceX because we can't manage better internally than to just do that. So I don't think the choice is just do that or just spin through the nose with big cost plus multi-billion-dollar programs to big legacy companies. I don't think that our choice is doing those two things. And I think what NASA is still struggling with is how do we accept that that's not the choice, and that even big aero companies we can still get tremendous work out of because they still have great capabilities, great technical people in those companies. So how do we get things from them, but without giving them these huge cost plus contracts where we now lose the ability to act like a customer and hold them accountable, performing on time and into their requirements? You can do that. And you can also work with companies like SpaceX, and you can give up less and less control of some of the details and rely on those companies to do good things for you. We have to figure out what are the right types of things to then enable or trust companies like SpaceX or Blue Origin or any of those companies, even Boeing, to go do those things unfettered by NASA. And then what are ways we can manage other companies to do other things for us that we're not willing to use that model with? But how do we do it in a way that we're not paying the legacy costs and in these multi-billion-dollar programs that then break us and we can't do anything else? I think you can manage those better. And I know from experience, I mean, we were able to get different behaviors like that out of legacy companies that supported the mission operations director at Johnson, just by managing them differently. And that's what I would love to see the agency do, is step up to doing some of those things across the board and then apply the right things to their what they call a commercial model and then manage their other contracts differently. I would tell you, NASA, by the way, if they were here right now listening, they would already have their mics unmuted and saying, and that's what we're doing right now. We're talking about all those things right now. So if they make progress in that, coupled with the Artemis objectives, this is a great time to be NASA. It's a great time to watch where we're going to go in space over the next 2 decades.
So within the, oh, you go, Gavin.
Okay. Naturally, when we talk about big NASA budgets and cancellations, the question comes up, like, why do we go to space? So I'm curious for you personally, why do you think it's important that we go to space?
Well, I could channel my inner Buzz Aldrin and say, if we're all living here and the big damn meteor finally hits us, the whole species is wiped out. Good going. So one of them is, hey, for species survival, we've got to figure out how to live elsewhere. And living on Mars isn't going to be it for the long haul. I mean, you can't live. I mean, Mars won't sustain us naturally. I mean, the beauty about, back in the day, as people migrated to different parts of the Earth itself supports our species pretty much everywhere we go. It becomes a little bit more challenging in some places, especially like in Antarctic or the Arctic, maybe a few deserts. But for the most part, the planet supports us pretty well. Planet doesn't support us all that well on Mars, and we can come up with all kinds of ways that we can figure out smart things to do to use resources at Mars. Most of it is right at, if not just beyond, our current technical capability, all of which are things we can contribute to solving. I don't think that anytime in the next century, you're just going to be able to go wander about anywhere on Mars without a suit on, and not being surrounded by an atmosphere and materials that are in the soil, all of which are contributing to kill you if you're exposed to them. It's just kind of the nature of the beast. we may find there's someplace else, I don't know, maybe Europa, who knows? There may be some other place in the solar system that is more hospitable to us. I doubt it. I mean, it might be more hospitable. I don't think we're going to find a place that we can just live. We're going to have to leave the solar system. So why go to space? We never leave if we don't at least get into Earth orbit, if we don't at least get to the moon, we don't at least get to Mars, we never get to another planet that can support us. And besides, that's what we do. I mean, we are at our finest when we are scratching the surface of this next thing that we don't understand. And in fact, that many of us think is impossible or unknowable. Gosh, when in history did that last very long? Ask Galileo. But those are the things that humanity has always, when we have made the world better for us, for the next generation of people, it's when we've finally gotten past that next barrier. Space is one of those. Keep pushing on those things because it brings out the best in us. And as Buzz Aldrin would say, getting our ass to Mars is the first step in getting our ass somewhere else where we can survive if something happens to the home planet. I wouldn't
Great answer.
I wouldn't bet your kids inheritance on being able to solve that problem for the next generation or two. But you got to take all of these first steps, and we're part of taking those first steps still.
Right.
So space tourism has always kind of been a high up goal of the space industry. The idea that just your regular average Joe could go up, take a flight, and be able to float around in space. Virgin Galactic, Blue Origin, SpaceX have all kind of expressed interest in that. And you may have even seen in the Super Bowl commercial recently, Inspiration 4, SpaceX commercial mission slated to launch, I believe, even next fall right now. So do you think this is the culmination and the start of that new age of space tourism? Or do you feel that this might be a little too early for a craft that only had its first manned flight last summer?
Well, one, yes, I think it's the start. Do I think that the current spacecraft, the current boosters, are the way Joe Everyman gets to fly in space? Not unless Joe Everyman is also a multimillionaire or if not a billionaire. I can't remember what the seats are going for. Last I saw, like for Spaceship Two, for example, and Virgin Galactic, I think I saw that those seats were going for $400K. Now you don't have to be a billionaire to afford $400K, but I won't plink down $400K for that. I could, by the way, but my wife and I would have to eat cat food for most of our retirement if I was to do that, probably, which she would definitely vote against. But $400K is a damn sight lower than the, I think, 20 to 30 million, and maybe more than that it costs to fly, say, a seat on SpaceX. And you may know, if you're there, you may know what SpaceX is charging the people that are already lining up and buying seats for these Axiom flights.
Mm-hmm.
But it's
I know we have the Tom Cruise contract for a movie who knows when, but they're expensive for sure.
For me, across the board, that's all good, because people like you and me aren't going to have a chance to buy it for $10,000 until these guys get their fill of doing it for $30 million or $400,000. It's kind of like, where we are with airlines today. In my lifetime, flying on airplanes was still significantly more expensive than it is today. I mean, when I was a kid, it was a coat and tie affair and very expensive still to fly on jets or to fly on airplanes. Actually, my first flights we did not have jet engines on the airplanes. And it was even before that, it was a rich man's province. But as that industry grew, just like in any industry, the supply went up and up and up, and the price came down as the demand stayed up, where now, you can fly anywhere in the world, and you're talking about thousands of dollars of investment, and you could even get lucky and in the hundreds of dollars fly halfway around the world if you catch the ticket at the right time. And that's what's going to happen in space flight. So what they're doing today and calling space tourism, which is really focused on that really tiny percent of the population that has a buttload of money, that is a great thing, because that means that 10 years from now, that price is going to drop dramatically. 10 years from that, it's going to drop even more dramatically. And the SpaceX's, the Virgin Galactics, they're the ones that are opening the door for that. So I absolutely think it's the right thing to do. I don't think that space tourism ends there and looks like it looks right now. Any more than commercial aviation today looks like commercial aviation in 1960. It is dramatically different and better today than it was in the 60s. Space tourism will change. I have no doubt at all that in your lifetime, maybe in my lifetime, but in your working lifetime, you will be able to fly into space, certainly suborbitally, at prices that you would be willing to bear, like for the cost of a car or less. And that in your lifetime, for the cost of a car or less, you might actually be able to fly into Earth orbit or even around the moon. It's coming. It's going to happen. But that won't happen anytime really, really soon. Well, not in the next few years, but it's coming. It's coming.
That's encouraging to hear.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope you're right.
Well, and that's the thing. They've got to bring the cost down. So it can't cost hundreds of millions of dollars to launch the booster in order for Joe Everyman to fly into space. I guess if what the heck is SpaceX's big Buck Rogers rocket?
Starship.
Yes, Starship. Thank you. So, if you could cram, hundreds of people all with their own window into a Starship, then you might be able to make what we know as current boosters, make it more economical to fly tourists into space on something like that. I think what's really going to do it is I think we're going to have to make that next significant leap in technology to things
like a scramjet space plane type idea.
You bet. And you might even do things like using maglev accelerators to accelerate that launch vehicle up to speeds where you can then you already get airborne at high velocities without having used onboard fuel. And then you use your onboard fuel with a scramjet to get into higher altitudes that you can then now switch to rockets and with fuel and oxidizer that you're carrying on board. I think it's going to be something like that, some fundamental technology shift like that, that's going to help bring those costs down and bring reliability and safety into a realm that looks more like what paying passengers would be willing to do. And when I say paying passengers, I mean like airline passengers, you taking your kids versus some rich dude that's willing to risk his life to go. It has to be more like you taking your kids on an airplane ride before it really becomes broad space tourism for Joe Anyman. But it's going to happen. It's coming. It's kind of like open heart surgery and heart replacements. That was the province of rich people when they first started doing it because it was ridiculously expensive. And now it's covered by almost all insurance plans. So it's coming.
Yep, just a matter of time, hopefully.
Well, a matter of time and a matter of people that are doing it not giving up and other people learning from their mistakes and their successes and jumping in and doing it themselves until finally somebody's going to make these next incremental leaps in technology where now all of a sudden we can do this more cheaply, we can do this more safely, and it makes more sense for us to be putting more people on board and we can charge a lower price because we can do it more often. That was a big thing SpaceX did by being able to reuse so much of their booster. Although I will say, at the risk of sounding like an old NASA guy with a chip on his shoulder, NASA had been doing that since 1981. And the only thing we didn't reuse was the fuel and oxidizer tank from first stage. Everything else was reused. Reusing it, though, took way too much touch labor and way too much full rebuild of those shuttle main engines, which were fabulous works of art, but really expensive to turn around and to fly again safely. And SpaceX has made huge steps down that path.
So there's just, I think, two more topics we want to talk about. And the first one being, could you tell us what it means to be an aquanaut?
So this would definitely be a category of remembering the difference between being a passenger and being a crew member. So the whole Nemo thing in diving with NERC in the Aquarius lab. I don't think it's NERC anymore. I don't remember who owns the lab now, but when I was there, it was the National Underwater Research Center. And it was a very cool opportunity. I was down there with 2 astronauts and this woman in this picture here, who's Jessica Mayer, who's an astronaut now. In fact, just came back from the space station last year. At the time, she was not an astronaut. She was a research scientist at NASA. It was a neat opportunity. I mean, I would say it's about as close as the space environment as you can get on the Earth. And when I say space environment, I don't really mean the zero G part. And I think some people try to equate the water experience to that. And I don't. But you're isolated and you're in a hostile environment that you can't survive in outside without the right kind of equipment. And it's very easy to kill yourself, even with the right equipment. So from that perspective, it was a very cool thing for me to see as somebody who worked in mission control, and I was never going to be on the spaceship in orbit. I was always going to be the guy ultimately looking over their shoulder from mission control, wishing I was there. It was a really cool way of being part of the operation and being in the environment.
So how did you get this opportunity in the first place? And did it kind of feel almost full circle of you wanting to be an astronaut and gain an opportunity here?
Oh yeah, I mean, as far as that goes, when the same year I was picked to be a flight director, I was selected in the astronaut selection process to be interviewed, and they have so many thousands of people that apply to be an astronaut that they are only interviewing a really small fraction of them. So just getting interviewed was a big deal, and in fact, some of my managers in the mission control organization were not happy with me when they found out I was interviewed for astronaut, since I had just interviewed and gotten selected to be a flight director. But I didn't get picked to be an astronaut. I would have loved to have, and I never gave that up. If any day, hell, today, if NASA came to me and said, "Hey, we've decided for whatever reason we need to throw you in space. Are you willing to go?" I'll pack my bag and fly to the Cape. So yeah, that was a really fun thing for me. I got to do it because the guys that managed the program, the guys that were the liaisons between NASA and this underwater research facility, and that had set everything up to get NASA people in the lab, and that were there on shore, monitoring what the NASA people were doing, things like that, working with the NERC people there in Florida. Those guys were all part of the mission control or the mission operations training organization. And so these were people that I had worked with in training for space missions. And one of them showed up at my office one day and he says, "Hey, Paul, we've never sent somebody from the flight director office down to Nemo." Of course, by then I was on the 4th group of NASA people that went, so not that many had been so far. Just, we were thinking it'd be a cool idea to send a flight director. Are you willing to go? It's kind of a no-brainer, And not only that, I'd never been certified in scuba. So the next thing I know, they fly me to Florida. I went through my entire scuba certification there at Key Largo with some people that were loosely affiliated with the lab there that you see on the right. So I spent a week living in Key Largo just to get basic scuba certified. Then I came back and did a bunch of scuba in the neutral buoyancy laboratory at Johnson, only to then go back to Key Largo and spend a week living in the lab underwater and diving, I don't know, 6 or 8 hours a day every day for a week while living on the bottom of the ocean. And it was about as cool as you would think it would be. In fact, the only part that's not cool or that's kind of weird is the part that's also kind of weird about flying in space, and it has to do with the toilet. And that's because the Aquarius lab has a toilet in it, but they really, really strongly frown on you using it because it funks up the smell of the air inside the module, and it takes hours and hours for the air system to filter that out. So of course, be good to your neighbor and go outside, and you literally go outside and hang it in the breeze when you have to go. And I would tell you, the first time I did that anyway, that was an unnatural experience. I got over it, but it was an unnatural experience. I would say some of my crewmates Actually, we had one crewmate. I won't rat this person out and tell you who it was, but one of my crewmates who was an astronaut. I don't think we were there in the lab for an hour, and that person already was outside, using the non-toilet, as it were. No problem at all. Took me a little while longer to finally work up the will to do it.
So, what is saturation diving? Could you kind of explain to us what that is?
Well, that it literally is, when you stay at the bottom or stay at pressure long enough that your bloodstream now becomes saturated with higher pressure nitrogen. So any amount of diving you do, if you go below 30 feet, you start taking the risk of compressing nitrogen bubbles in your bloodstream. As the water pressure goes up, and you're breathing higher and higher pressure air through the regulator from your tank, the nitrogen bubbles in the blood start to compress, and you start building up more nitrogen in the blood just from the air that you're breathing. And you have to come up slowly in order to give that nitrogen time to go back into solution into your blood, and not just form large bubbles. Because if it forms those large bubbles, you then get the bends and are at risk of being injured and dying. Saturation diving is you've now been deep enough, long enough, that you need hours and hours in order to come up even more slowly in order to get that nitrogen out of your blood, because your blood is now so super saturated with nitrogen. So for the Aquarius lab, which then I think it's still in the same place, was sitting at, I think the hatch opening at the bottom is 70 feet. So the air pressure inside is equivalent to being 70 feet down in the water, which is not quite 3 atmospheres. Is that right? I guess not quite 4 atmospheres. So the nitrogen in your blood is really heavily saturated, such that if that person you see in the picture, if they were to take weights off and kick for the surface, they would undoubtedly die from the worst type of decompression sickness that you could have. And they'd form all kinds of bubbles in the bloodstream. They get all kinds of bubbles in their nervous system. And so that's what saturation diving is, which is one of the reasons why the people at NERC were so well equipped and so well trained. I mean, you spent a week down there doing training on their relatively elaborate diving system, where they essentially use double tanks, double regulators, so very similar to what you would use for cave diving, so that you had multiple air sources. And we trained for having different things fail and having to switch air sources. Having to switch and use air sources from your buddy when you're diving, even when your buddy's air systems are also failing. So you're extraordinarily well trained on those things. In fact, even how to do all of those things, and how to navigate on the bottom of the ocean when you can't see because you don't have a mask on, because it's so imperative that no matter what happens, you have to get back to the module. Because if you can't get back to the lab and have to eventually give up and go to the surface, you're not going to survive. So that's saturation diving for you.
So this is a video.
Go ahead.
This is a video from a video from NEMO 19, but they refer to their EVAs as like a spacewalk. So it seems like a full-on simulation. So I'm wondering what sort of like activities you guys did down there.
Now, when I was there, and I couldn't tell you what they've been doing since. When I went down, they were doing a lot of coral analysis and corals, almost census taking for some NOAA projects. So there were some PhDs that were monitoring the health of the coral, the reefs in that area. And this all it goes back to a couple of things. One of them is bleaching. Another one has to do with infestation from algae. And so we would have different sectors that were mapped out for us every day. And our job was to go out in those parts of the reef and literally count and take pictures of the different corals that we saw in like 20-foot grids. And our job was to go like grid by grid doing that kind of a census, and none of which was data that we used for anything. All of that was handed over to NOAA for programs that they were doing. And we did plan it and mapped out the days, modeling them on the way that we planned the days for crews on the space station. So we had a team on shore that would actually plan the day out, including like with wake up, the things that you do, like brushing your teeth and getting dressed, taking showers, that kind of stuff, to eating as a team, reviewing what we were going to do on the next dive, and suiting up and going on the dive, coming back, having lunch. I mean, pretty much the whole day mapped out, and you would execute from this plan. At the end of the day, you would talk it over with the team on shore, talk about the next day. You'd wake up the next day, print out the next plan. We pretty much executed it like you executed space flights. So especially for astronauts who had not yet been in space, it was a good introduction for what's life like that going to be like. And for astronauts that not only haven't been in space, but maybe they don't come from an operational environment. Like, they're not from flying, or they're not from, say, submarine operations or something like that. It's a good way for them to experience what's life like outside of an engineering job or outside of a laboratory, but no kidding, in an operational facility where you are out in the environment and doing things before they're put in space doing it, where the risks are even higher.
Oh.
So I just found this out this morning, actually, while doing some last second research. But your commander for Nemo 4 was Scott Kelly, who is arguably probably one of the most famous astronauts of our day. What was that like?
We had a good time. We had a good time. So on the one hand, he's a really smart guy. I mean, I was down there, not up there, with Scott, with Rex Walheim, and Jessica Mayer, who also then became an astronaut. Oh, really?
I think Rex is as well, actually.
He what? Oh yeah, Rex is an astronaut, but he and Scott were astronauts when we went down there. But Jessica is now too. All three really smart people. So we had a really good time. We had a lot of fun. The thing that was one, so with Rex and Scott both being experienced astronauts, and they also knew Jessica really well by then. And then with me as a flight director, we were all pretty experienced people. And so we all just got along really well. But we also spent that week in training together. It's sort of like an astronaut team does before they fly in space. So we had bonded together pretty well as a group. But we also, depending on how you look at it, we're lucky enough that we had a hurricane that was threatening to go through the Keys. And instead of sending us home to Houston, we said, look, let's all go on hold. So you guys take the week, do whatever you're going to do, stay in the area. And if this hurricane blows by, we'll bring you back, and down you go. And you're going to spend your time at the bottom of the ocean. So we spent the next week in the Florida Keys without a job. So we'd get up every morning, we'd run or do whatever we were going to do. We'd maybe go do some sightseeing thing. And then we'd go to a bar night after night. I mean, it was not unlike, say, the week before school starts when you were in college. And we laughed and told people after we got back that, like in my case, I don't think I drank that much since I was in college. This is probably not the best advertisement for this, by the way, for NASA, but this is what the experience was like since you asked. I don't think I drank that much since I was in college, and we needed to go down underwater so that we could all dry out because there was no booze in the module or in the lab. But we had a really good time together. In fact, I have pictures of us in the goofiest places, because as we'd be driving along, Scott would at any moment go, "Giant sea creature," and there would be like in front of a restaurant, just on the side of the road in the Florida Keys somewhere, a giant lobster. And I say giant, I mean like the size of a car or the size of a house. Any place we went, if there was a giant sea creature, we had to pull over, and the four of us got out, and we had somebody take a picture of the four of us standing with the giant sea creature. And I bet I have pictures of us with 8 different giant sea creatures in the middle of nowhere. That would be the most famous astronaut of your generation.
That's incredible.
Like I said, we had a lot of fun doing goofy stuff like that.
I think, oh yeah, you go ahead, Gavin.
Yeah, I think our last topic is your experience writing books and your upcoming book. So sort of what was it like to make that decision to write these books? What made you want to do that? And then what is your upcoming book about?
Well, my leadership book was one that, when I went through the experience starting in about 2007, when I was part of the MOD leadership team that started coming to terms with how terrible we had become as a leadership team, and then doing something about it, and then figuring out, now, how do we make this a replicating process that we can push down into our team? That had such a profound effect on me that I had been wanting to write that down, and how we did it, and how does each next team do it. I'd been wanting to write that down for years after we went through it. And the farthest I had gotten was working with some of our human resources people on kind of a training program that we used for our people as we started picking the people that we saw as high potentials to be managers. We came up with sort of a training flow that you could use, the 5 core books that our management team used to kind of go through this evolution in our own thinking. But I had wanted to write the whole story. How did we figure this out? Well, first, how did we become as terrible as we were? And I say we, I don't just mean our generation, but over time, how did our leadership team lose its way? I'd been wanting to do that for the longest time. And the NASA lawyers first told me that I could do that. I was allowed to do it while I was still a NASA person. So I started writing it. In the first chapter or two I had written and actually circulated around through the other guys, or the other people, not all guys, the other people that were on the management team that had gone through the experience with me. And what I wanted to hear from them is, hey, look this over, and what did I leave out? And which part am I giving us too much credit? Keep me honest here, because I want this to be like both on the bad side. How did we become so bad, and what did bad look like? I want it to be accurate, right? I want to be able to paint the picture. This is what happened to us, and this is how we became aware of it, and how we climbed our way out of it. And I had started that process. In fact, some of the people that I had went through that process with, I was expecting them to come back and not be happy with me. Hey, you're making us look bad. You can't say this. Some of what you're saying makes the guys we learned this from look bad. Don't say that. I was expecting to hear some of that, understandably, right? Because you're kind of talking about the old guard, or you're talking about family, and I didn't name people by name, and I use we a lot, right? Because I was part of all of this, and I was surprised. A couple of these folks came back and said, "Paul, it was way worse than this, man. You got to say it the way it was, and it was worse than this," which I felt mildly good about. That they weren't wanting to make it look better. But the NASA lawyers came back after I had written the first couple of chapters and said, hey, we've been reconsidering, and we didn't really think about it. When you apply the law, if you write this book while you still work for NASA, you can't copyright it, because it would be profiting off of your federal experience. And you can do that after you retire. You can't do that while you still wear the badge. That went a long way to helping me with the decision I was already mulling over on, is it time? And so when I retired, my whole focus was retire, write this book, because it was almost as a compelling emotional thing for me as that trauma was after the Columbia accident. This one less traumatic, but I felt this huge obligation to write that down, because I thought, here's what's going to happen. I'm not going to write this down. And the generation that went through this and figured out how to undo it, we're all going to separate, move on to other things. And the corporation is going to forget this lesson, and it's going to have been lost. And it's so applicable, not just for us, but for everyone else. And so I set out writing that book, which it took me about a year to get it written and get it published. In fact, the learning experience for me was, as fresh as all of that was in my head, I really thought I needed about 6 weeks. I'm going to sit down at the computer, and in 6 weeks, I'm going to have the whole darn thing written and ready to rock. And what I realized was, it's one thing to have the ideas in my head and be able to talk about them. It's a different thing altogether to say, now, what do I start at? And how do I explain that in a way that makes you want to turn the page? And what's the right logical way to step through this one thing at a time? And as I got into it, this thing that felt so familiar to me and so fresh to me took me a year to get it to the state that I thought, no, I can put this on a shelf and anybody can read it. Anybody inside MOD can read it and apply it, and will be proud of it, which was important to me. and anybody outside MOD could read it and apply it to their own situation. And by then, I had started speaking in like management conferences or to private companies, to their management teams on those same topics, the same topics that I wrote about in the book, same general ideas I talked about. And I did that. In fact, I had been doing really well with all of that until COVID. And I tell you that only because that was kind of the segue into the book that I'm almost finished with now. And in the time that I was doing this public speaking, I had gotten involved with a group called the Marshall Goldsmith 100, which is a group of executive coaches mostly that a very famous executive coach named Marshall Goldsmith put together, that he considers his leadership and coaching experts from around the world, people that he intended to sort of gift all of his knowledge and experience base to leave us as the generation behind him that keeps going with where he was, with the idea that we're going to find 100 before we're done, that we're going to do the same thing with. In the Marshall Goldsmith 100, one of my colleagues there, a great gal named Whitney Johnson, who just happened to have a podcast based on a book that she wrote called Disrupt Yourself. And she had me on her podcast just before COVID, coincidentally. And she asked me, hey, if you could do anything else besides this leadership speaking that you've been doing, what would you do? And I said, well, since I was in college, I've wanted to write novels. And I have a handful of novels that I have been writing notes on literally since I was in the Air Force. One of them being a story that one of my closest friends and I were on a day hike one time. And to keep us occupied, I recited the story off the top of my head to him. And he turns around at the end and he didn't say a word to me the whole time we're hiking. He was in front of me, never turned around, said anything, never spoke a word. And when we finished, he turned around and looked at me and he goes, holy shit, did you just make all that up? That was incredible. And so I'm telling Whitney this. I said, so if I could do anything, I would love to do that. And she says, well, why aren't you doing it? I said, well, I was good at the space stuff, number one, and I found out I can't do both. Like my leadership book, I couldn't do and do my full-time MOD job because not just because of the lawyers, the focus it took to do the right thing on the leadership book. I couldn't do both unless I wanted to spend 5 years writing the book. So there's that. But I was also thinking, this is so important to me. I'm afraid that if I try it, because it's a different part of the brain, that kind of creativity, I might find out I suck at it. I don't want to find that out. So I'll just keep wishing I was doing it and be happy with the fact that, gee, I wish I had someday taken the time to do it. And she practically, in her podcast, almost double dog dared me. You can't leave that laying there. Somebody dares you to do it. But she pretty much challenged me, if this is that important to you, make the time, start doing it. And about 2 weeks later, I started doing it. And within a month, COVID struck. And all of the speaking business I had already booked, all of it just evaporated as all of those companies stopped, travel stopped, all of those kind of things that you guys are very familiar with in school. And I had all this time. And I kind of looked at it like, well, okay, full-time writing the book, here I go. And so here we're right at a year later, and I have half a chapter to go, and I'll be finished with that first book, my first novel.
That's incredible. Is today the day you finish it, hopefully?
Well, probably not today, because today I was spending time talking to two guys from the University of Texas in a podcast, and that ate up a bunch of my time. The key part isn't the time that it took. The key part, and now this is going to make me start sounding like a rock star diva. The thing is, though, it is I don't know. Other writers may have different things. I had the same thing for my leadership book. I have to get in the mindset. I have to get in the groove, and it takes me some time to get in that groove where, okay, now the creative thing, I'm there, and the story is alive to me again. Because for me, anyway, and because this is fiction, although actually my leadership book was the same. The story is not just a matter of stringing together the sentences and I move on to the next thing. I mean, it is alive in my head. My challenge is keeping up with the characters and the story that's in my head and getting it down and doing it justice. And it takes me a little while to kind of get into that place where now it's flowing. And let's see, what time is it here? So it's just afternoon. I'll probably get there. like if we were to hang up right now, I'd say by 1:30 or so, hour and a half from now, I'll kind of get my mind right, get other things out of my head. Just in time for my wife to come home from work. Not that I'm blaming her, but I will also say, being the rock star diva mindset, that just having somebody here at the house, even if like my wife was here and not talking to me, walking by is enough of a distraction that I can't kind of stay in that sweet spot creatively. I realize that sounds kind of diva-like, but all I can say is, whether I understand it or not, I know it's how it works. So to answer your question, I know I won't be finishing today. I know I'll finish this chapter and the epilogue, which is all I have to go. I will have it finished next week, which is just in time because I have a Zoom call with a literary agent at the end of next week. So I really want to have the entire manuscript ready to go before I talk with her.
That's great. Does it have a title yet?
The Last Butterfly.
All right. I'm looking forward to reading it. I'll definitely get it off the shelves the second it hits.
Well, when you do, feel free to give me your unfiltered thoughts. And I am definitely, while I would love to hear everyone loves it, what I really want to hear is what people actually think when they read it. I would hate to find out I suck at it, but I'd rather find out the truth now,
Yeah, that's your flight director personality coming out. Tell me what's wrong now, right?
That's right. It will hurt to find out that I'm the only one that loves my story, but I would still rather find it out than have everybody else but me know it.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that won't be the case. Well, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. It's been an honor.
It's my pleasure. I've enjoyed it. I'm sorry I've taken so much of your time.
No, we're sorry we're taking so much of your time. It's honestly so great to be able to have you on and be able to talk to you for this amount of time. We were thinking like, how are we going to fit this into an hour? There's no way. But yeah, we're extremely grateful for sure.
And you were right.
Yep.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure. Anytime. I consider it part of the obligation I'll always have from the privilege I had of doing the work that I did at NASA. I owe it to talk to anybody that wants to hear about it as much as they want to hear about it. So it's my pleasure.
Awesome.
Definitely. Next time we're at the marshes, I definitely owe you a drink.
Well, I'll take you up on it. You can swing by the tailgate sometime. Hopefully we'll be there this fall. Oh, I forget. Other school. Well, you never know. You might be in College Station. Swing by.
Hey, I've been around there before. I'll probably go back eventually.
There you go.